Hello, I'm Hannah Kaye, and welcome to this Intelligence Squared event with Nabila Ramdani. Nabila is a French-Algerian journalist, and she's the author of the new book, Fixing France, How to Mend a Broken Republic. And today she's in conversation with Mehreen Khan, who is economics editor of The Times. Over to you, Mehreen.
Nabila, welcome to Intelligence Squared. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Mehreen.
Nabila Ramdani is a French-Algerian writer from Paris who works as an academic, a journalist, and a broadcaster, mainly covering France, the Arab, and the Muslim world. She's written for publications ranging from The Guardian to the Daily Mail and the Washington Post, and broadcast for outlets like Sky News, Al Jazeera, and CNN. Her new book is called Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic. We're going to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes talking about Nabila's motivations for writing the book, some of her prognostications about the state of France today, and also I think a book which is incredibly prescient because by the time you've already hit publish, it seems that so many of the warnings in these pages are playing out in the French Senate, in the French Assembly, and across the streets of France as we speak. Maybe just on that note, this is a book which has I think a relatively provocative title, perhaps, especially because you're writing it in English for an international audience, I imagine, to try and understand some of the pathologies of modern France. Why, Nabila, did you think now was the time to write this book?
Well, frankly, I think that the direct answer to this is that I think France is an extremely interesting place at the moment, and that there weren't many books around really explaining why, and I really wanted to fill that gap. I've been writing journalistic articles about France throughout my career, but even the 2,000-word feature often felt insubstantial. So, I had a lot more to say about France, and the logical ambition was to write an entire book about it. And, they say you write about what you know, and I certainly know masses about modern France and all of its problems. And I was also, dare I say, very conscious that the book market is dominated by a very privileged class of people who went to the right schools, who went to the right universities, and who come from very rich and indeed comfortable backgrounds. And so people like me, who come from a far more modest background, an immigrant background, a council estate background, are certainly not meant to write this kind of state of the nation books, if you like, and I wanted to change that. But dare I say, more crucially, I wanted to cut through the myths about France. France is a wonderful country in principle. The constitution of the current Fifth Republic is meant to achieve, liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. But in practice, it has often, achieved the opposite. In fact, it has alienated millions of people from a system that looks after its elite. And you were talking about, the fault lines about France and why it's relevant now in particular. And I would say that one of the major fault lines I described in my book is the absurd amount of power invested in one president, and indeed the very real danger that this one president might soon be a full-blown extremist committed to state racism, to put it bluntly. And that's why I was determined to write this book now. France is a country that is not adapting to the modern world. And I would argue it's going through an identity crisis. And I certainly wanted to highlight these failures and indeed provide solutions. And that's why I would say that my book is very much a disruptive book, but in a positive way. It follows in the great French tradition of dissenting progress, effectively.
Can I ask about what initial reactions your book has met in France? And was it a deliberate choice to write this book in English? And are you planning a French translation anytime soon?
Yes, I think France is a very interesting country. It remains a riddle in many ways for a lot of international observers, and that's why I wanted to write about it in English to reach out to a global audience. I have to say it hasn't been translated into French yet. I do hope it reaches the French market for effectively to allow the country to do some soul searching, which I think is absolutely needed. So I haven't had masses of feedback yet from the French public or indeed the French establishment. But what I can tell you already is that each time I brought up the book in discussions with civil servants, they just didn't want to talk about it. They invoked what they call the droit de réserve, i.e., the right to abstain from talking about politics precisely because they are members of the government and on the government's payroll, effectively. But in the past, when I have, published hard-hitting articles about France and, what's wrong with it, I have been met with criticism from civil servants accusing me of being anti-patriotic, and I think that's a very unfair criticism. As I said, my book is very much a positive, constructive criticism that hopefully will allow France to look at itself and adapt to a rapidly changing world.
Yeah, I think we've probably both had experiences as journalists writing about some of the more painful sore spots around France. And from my perspective, I'm not French, but being based in Brussels and writing about European affairs, a constant critique is that you don't really understand the country, and Anglo-Saxons can't really get under the skin of France. And what really struck me about the book is that you're completely right. There seems to be a sort of Olympic Games in existentialism around what France is, its identity, a certain degree of French declinism, which you see from public intellectuals across the country. But it seems that there are only some types of people that are allowed to be legitimate critics of France. And it always struck me as somebody coming from the UK that those second, third generation immigrants, people in the media or intellectuals were never allowed to occupy a space where they could think radically about how to change France. This was always something which is now increasingly reserved to the far right of the political spectrum, and you see that with people like Eric Zemmour, who go from being public intellectuals to political figures and even cult icons for the right. And that's why I think the book is so significant. And you've already touched upon one of the, I think, delusions about modern France, and one of the mythologies that you think is quite poisonous, which is the executive and the power that is put into the hands of the president. What are some of the other sort of delusions or mythologies that you isolate in this book as being problematic and something that is holding modern France back?
Well, I think France is a country made up of very beautiful myths. And to quote the architect of the Fifth Republic himself, General Charles de Gaulle, and the wartime hero, France is, in his words, a perpetual illusion. And that's why it's easy, in fact, to get lost in that romanticism while missing the real story of France. And, sure enough, France is the most visited country in the world for very good reasons. Visitors primarily go there for all the good things in life, and many even aspire to live there. They like the culture, they like the food, they like the beautiful landscapes. But there's also an extremely generous welfare state that includes universal access to education and indeed to healthcare, which is a source of envy around the world. To go on about the positive aspects of France, Paris, the capital city, is an Olympic city. It's also the epicenter of ecological hope. It lends its very name to the United Nations Paris Climate Accords of 2015. But dare I say, beyond all that, there certainly was a need for a book that explains how France is, in fact, failing to live up to its once exalted reputation. And I think impossibly high ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity are the obvious self-identifiers to highlight straight away. And I'll tell you why, because they talk to a France of a belle époque, when France allegedly represented not just peace and prosperity, but incredible technological breakthroughs that benefited everyone. It also speaks to a France where the medieval slums that bred disease and discontent in my home city of Paris were replaced by a golden, modern Paris with avenues and parks and aqueducts. But I think that what makes France especially interesting is that it is overwhelmed by idealism. And this goes back to those who created a republic based on sacred texts that concentrate on Enlightenment values that are frankly impossible to apply to real life. And the reality is that France has lost its grandeur. And this manifests itself domestically in ancient institutions that I contend are not fit for purpose any longer. The part of this crisis engulfs corruption, civil strife, industrial decay, and there's also a sense of downgrading on the international stage, a déclassement where France is no longer the great power that it once was. And as someone who was born in France to Algerian parents, I think I'm particularly well placed to examine, this dichotomy in a sense whereby you've got freedom and equality for one group of people, one group of French citizens, but that actually means that another group of citizens is deprived of those same freedoms. So, again, the reason why I wrote the book in English is that despite this world famous motto of liberté, égalité, and fraternité, there is in fact widespread inequality, clampdowns on freedom and social divisions that really move us away from any sense of fraternity.
You spend a lot of time in the book speaking about the perils that have been wrought because of the Fifth Republic, and a lot of that, it seems that there is a sort of original sin that is attached to the Fifth Republic. So you concentrate a lot on the conditions in which that republic was born, the Algerian War, how French brutality was, marked this entire episode at the beginning of this constitution, and perhaps is something that's never really been reconciled with by the French political establishment. The country's national psyche is the real origin myth of modern France. What is the original sin, and how are we seeing the continuation of this, the trappings of the colonial state in the 21st century in France, and how much can we trace back to that moment when this republic was born?
Well, an awful lot, actually. I think a fundamental fault line in France today, and arguably the biggest one, is that the Fifth Republic was literally set up as a power arrangement to deal with Algerians. In other words, the Fifth Republic was directly born out of the Algerian War of Independence. And perhaps that's why those of us from an Algerian background are particularly well qualified to analyze the current failings of the country. The constitution of the Fifth Republic created what can only be described as a president king, and this, as I was saying, this absurd amount of power invested in one president is the major fault line in France today. And, to give you more specific historical background, which underpins my book, it all goes back to May 1958. The Algerian War of Independence was at its height when European settlers, supported by the French army, launched a putsch against the Governor General in Algiers, and they called for the dissolution of the government in Paris so that it could be replaced by one that was more explicitly and indeed more robustly committed to the survival of Algeria as a colony, which was in actual fact more than a colony. It was considered as part of mainland France. And the putschists argued that General Charles de Gaulle, who had been in the wilderness for 12 years after leading the Free French through the Second World War, they effectively argued that he was the only leader capable of preventing the abandonment of Algeria. And therefore, the National Assembly approved the restoration of de Gaulle to take charge of the country. He was in his 60s by then, but de Gaulle said he would only accept this new role after the precondition, or under the precondition that a new constitution would end the Fourth Republic and that it would include an all-powerful president. And so the first president of the Fifth Republic would naturally be General Charles de Gaulle himself. But more than that, he wanted extraordinary powers to deal with the security threat that was posed by the increasingly successful Algerian nationalists. And I think that's where the original sin, as you quite rightly put it, comes from. De Gaulle wanted the new presidency to be able to fight all types of dissent with extreme robustness. And this was effectively the foundation of this massively powerful security state that we have today, and indeed the start of a president, an alpha male head of state, who literally lives in a palace and who is commander in chief of all the armed forces in France. But more than that, he can rule by decree, just like the pre revolutionary kings, in fact. He can bypass parliament completely in a manner that is, frankly, woefully undemocratic. And this is where we get this notion of a quasi monarchical president. And so, one of the main arguments in my book is that the Fifth Republic was created on a democratic deficit, to say the least. And this affects every aspect of French life.
And it is a deliberate democratic deficit. I mean, these were the explicit conditions in which de Gaulle felt that the country needed to bring back stability. There is talk, it used to be in the far left circles with the party of Jean-Luc Mélenchon for a sixth republic. France, probably more than any other modern European country, is known for this almost constant constitutional revolution. What do you feel about the prospects of a sixth republic, and if you were in charge, and I know the book puts out some recommendations on how France should move to a more parliamentary style of democracy, what could that sixth republic look like? And I guess a more sensitive question is that how much political and social upheaval would it cause, or would you need to trigger such a huge national debate about the need for renewal and change in France today, given how polarized the entire country and so much of its politics seems to be?
Well, that's an absolutely crucial question. And I would say that the country's constitution cannot be rewritten or updated without any major political or indeed social upheaval. That would be almost impossible in my view. And the major social and political upheavals come in the run up to reform. And that's what we're seeing today. Macron's 2 terms have been a constant stream of massive riots, starting with the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vests, very soon after he came to power in 2017. They were effectively bringing major cities to a standstill pretty much every Saturday and caused millions of euros worth of damage. There's also the constant or regular youths, erupting on housing estates, as we saw this summer alone, following the shooting dead of Nahel Marzouk, a French teenager of Algerian and Moroccan background, who was shot dead by a police officer. And before that, there were huge protests against pension reforms, for example. But instead of listening to the demonstrators, Macron just pushed through his reforms forward using presidential decrees. And, the headline change as far as the pension reform was concerned was a rise in the retirement age from 62 to 64, something that infuriated millions of French people. But I think the point here was not really about the age of retirement. It was more that Macron was not listening to people, and crucially, he was ignoring parliament. And the constitution of the Fifth Republic empowers the executive at the expense of the legislative bodies. And so it creates this kind of supreme leader who pretty much does everything. And the main change I would envisage would be a Sixth Republic that returns power to parliament, and so makes France a far more democratic country. And this would end, the fact that we have one man who can literally appoint his prime minister, choose his ministers, who can be, friends or business cronies or political friends of his. And I think this would effectively allow uh, prevent him from dissolving parliament on a whim, and this is also the kind of structural flaws that encourage sleaze at the heart of the republic. And so, in brief, I would say that a returning parliamentary government, and indeed cabinet government over presidential government, would be an obvious flagship reform, so that the system doesn't allow one determined individual to take over running the whole show. And not least because of the very real danger of ending up with a far right president that can rule just like Macron does at the moment, by decree, even appointing unelected bigots to all positions, including that of prime minister.
It's I think it's a very important question, and about the powers of the French Parliament. And we're actually speaking in a week where I don't think the Assemblée Nationale has ever had more international attention paid to it, or at least in my years of watching French politics, the Parliament has never been so front and center of political drama. And that's because we are speaking in a week where the French government, the sitting French government, tried to put through a very controversial migration bill, and it faced a revolt. So Macron faced a revolt from within his own ranks, because that migration bill was going to be passed with the support of Marine Le Pen's far right party, and they wanted to avoid that situation. And in the end, we come up with a fudge where the bill is passed. There is a majority even without the far right, and Macron stumbles on. I'm curious, just because this is quite a live event, has the attention that's been put onto the parliament changed anything about the way French people, the French media, or even the political class think about the Assemblée Nationale as a body? Is this provoking any soul searching about maybe we could have a slightly different system where the parliament and things that happen in that parliament will be important enough to constrain the options of the very powerful president?
Well, you're quite right to highlight what can only be described as a very dramatic week in the French Parliament. What effectively has happened is that Marine Le Pen claimed an ideological victory, in her own words, because she has forced Macron to accept, hard right amendments to his immigration bill, which successfully went through Parliament thanks to the vote and support of far right members of Parliament. Um, and the far right is, of course, is a huge issue in modern France, and there's no doubt that the presidential system empowers them. The cruel irony is that Emmanuel Macron came to power as effectively promising to be a bulwark against extremism, and especially the far right. And he's now ending up effectively governing with the far right at the very heart of the National Assembly. Let's not forget that the National Rally, who was formerly known as the National Front, is a party that was founded by actual Nazi veterans. And here we are. We could have their leader, who could potentially become head of state in 2027, despite having only 89 MPs or so in parliament. But I would say that Marine Le Pen has played the system very cunningly. But a sixth republic could easily be organized to prevent extremists like her coming to power without so much as a serious party in parliament, let alone a parliamentary majority. And in general term, I think there is support, vast support in France for a sixth republic being shorthand for a different way of doing things, if you like.
I'm interested in your sort of views on why Macron got to where he is, and you write in the book about meeting him and speaking to him before his 2017 election. As you mentioned, he was the great hope for those who feared the far right. He was the great hope, from my perspective at that time, for the European Union, as somebody who had ideas to reform the state of the EU, to deepen its integration, to increase its powers. He was a liberal, and to some degree, a liberal strongman, and that really attracted a lot of international attention and praise. Was it always inevitable that Macron would end up where he is right now, which is stuck between his own party, which doesn't really have an identity, and a far right, which seems to be dictating its agenda? Is your sort of diagnostic position that the system of the French Republic will always push any president towards extremes, because that's the only way that they can sufficiently govern, by having effectively every 4 or 5 years a plebiscite between themselves and an extremist, and then to try and position themselves as close as possible to the extremists, while telling voters that they are not really the real deal? Or is this actually just a series of choices that Macron has made, policy choices about security, about migration, about Islam, about the economy, that could have been avoided if he was a different type of character?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, frankly. When Macron came to power, he was the luckiest president. He won. He became president of France in the most unexpected manner, and he benefited greatly from the collapse of the traditional parties, the Gaullist conservatives, a party that was mired by sleaze scandals, despite calling themselves Gaullist, which draws onto the tradition of the General Charles de Gaulle, who effectively epitomized the morality and the virtue of France. And on the other hand, the Socialist Party imploded completely with François Hollande, the previous socialist president, proving to be completely inefficient. And so Macron took advantage of that situation, if you like, and became president of France in the most unexpected manner possible. And the system, as I was saying, the current French presidential system allows for that kind of one determined individual to reach ultimate power. Macron didn't even have a proper political party. He created a movement called En Marche. Interestingly, the acronym of his movement, EM, is just an echo of his own initials, Emmanuel Macron. And so he represented himself, basically. But as he, started to govern the country, he came as a centrist, as a liberal reformist, and very much as a pragmatic politician who claimed to belong neither to the right, neither to the left. Interestingly, he was part of the socialist government. He was, in fact, Hollande's economics minister, but he had never signed up to the Socialist Party. And his background is in banking. So he is very much perceived as belonging to this global elite that looks after its own effectively. And he started to pander more and more to the right votes, to the far right votes, because he knows that issues such as immigration, for example, which are hugely controversial, are still very important to what can only be described as parochial France, as a very provincial France that still looks inwards. But beyond his own political choices, I think it's fair to say that it's the system of the Fifth Republic, the flawed structural foundations that allow this kind of quasi-monarch to rule, by decree, effectively, and by bypassing the very legislative bodies, and also getting rid of all the checks and balances, effectively.
It does feel like the progressive dream of Macron in 2017 has very much faded, and it seems difficult to remember a time when he did act in this role. And every time I see the French media, I notice that only a few days ago, one of the paradigmatic student figures in the 1968 revolutions, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who put himself behind Macron, has now also abandoned Macron and is urging people to find political alternatives and trying to embolden political alternatives on the progressive left. And it feels like he has been abandoned by so many of those who put so much hope into him in 2017. I think maybe, we should also speak, and we've mentioned it in passing a lot, Marine Le Pen. It seems now more than ever that this 2027 forthcoming election won't just be like all the other ones where the far right has also managed to make it into the second round of the presidential vote. And for memory, Le Pen has been in the second round where she has steadily increased her vote share, but she's never made it past the threshold. And perhaps the system is designed to ensure that that never happens. What are the prospects of a 2027 Marine Le Pen victory? And what would the implications be for France in a country which has already turned right on so many issues? And I also hear in different circles that, what's the damage that Le Pen can really do when Macron has done so much? And this is something that you hear a lot from the progressive parts of the French left, who, maybe call for abstention in voting in second rounds because they just don't see any difference between the two. Does Le Pen represent really a qualitative difference in what a French president looks like and the ideals that she represents? Could they actually wreak as much destruction on France and Europe as a lot of people fear?
Yes, very much so. Not least of all because as I mentioned earlier, the roots of the party that was founded in 1972 by her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, who is, let's not forget, a convicted racist and an anti-Semite. The roots of the party are very much steeped in fascism. Founding members of the National Front were actual, veterans of the Waffen-SS. Others literally fought within the milice that was, the armed branch that collaborated with Nazi Germany. And, this legacy hasn't gone away in the French political sphere. And I think Marine Le Pen's messaging, is very straightforward. It basically boils down to immigration, immigration, and immigration. She wants to keep, anybody who is perceived as an alien out of France, including people who were born and raised in France, like myself. And that's very much part of the new immigration bill. And then there is this idea that she's creating this, fantasy enemy within that basically is anybody who is not of French stock, effectively. So the prospect of having someone like her taking complete charge of the country is absolutely terrifying. Her stances on Islam are just equally chilling. And dare I say, she's also economically illiterate. So the kind of constituency that she appeals to, the left behind France that you find also in rural, vast rural areas, but also on, industrial towns that have found it very difficult to move on from industrial decay. These kind of voters would expect an awful lot from her, from an economic perspective. They would hope that she manages to overcome these vast economic injustices, but she doesn't have a clue about how to run a country, and her economics policies are basically non-existent. So it would be a terrifying prospect, not least of all in the context of the European Union as well. For example, France is, of course, a founding member of the EU project. Initially, the National Rally was fiercely anti-EU. She has now, Marine Le Pen has now toned down that rhetoric because she realizes that actually the French get an awful lot out of the EU. And on the international stage, as far as her foreign policy is concerned, that's also quite a terrifying prospect. She obviously was a firm backer of Vladimir Putin in Russia. She visited him a number of times in the Kremlin. supported his policies, took Russian loans to fund her campaign, and she wants to pull out of the command and system of NATO, which is also very controversial. So I don't think she's got the stuff of a leader at all. She's not only economically illiterate, but also bigoted in the most, provincial, parochial way possible. And again, this goes back to the idea I put out that France has lost its grandeur in many ways, and she epitomizes that downgrading.
I think there's also a qualitative difference between thinking about the 27 election and perhaps the 2017 election or even 2022, when the idea seemed to be that if France selects a far-right leader, then France will isolate itself internationally in the European Union. I think now it's the case that if you could have a Le Pen president in 27, she could look around Europe and even the US and find bedfellows and allies. We already have Giorgia Meloni, who comes from a neo-fascist party in Italy, as a prime minister of Italy. The Netherlands chose overwhelmingly backed a anti-Islam far-right candidate who sort of mimics Le Pen in so many ways. And then, of course, there is the prospect of a Donald Trump re-election. Add to that people like Viktor Orban or Robert Fico in Slovakia. And I think the story is less of France being isolated, but even worse prospect of a far-right France finding bedfellows to change the agenda to create a more far-right Europe and a more far-right international Western foreign policy. And perhaps one of the first tests of that will come in the summer just upon us in 2024, where Le Pen's party will be standing for the European Parliament's elections. And these are often seen as not always accurate, but they're definitely proxies for what's been happening in a country domestically. Is there any debate about the resurgence of the Rassemblement National as soon as the summer of 2024? Is this something that is on the agenda among the French political establishment, or are they too busy fighting sort of more short-term fires right now?
Well, the very fact that she's now a part of a governing coalition with the Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party in Parliament sums it up really, and it sums up this prospect of having her as the next president of France. At the moment, it looks like she's got a really good chance. But I would contend that this is part of my main argument, which is that France isn't adapting with, or keeping up with a rapidly changing world. The fact that she represents the best that France can offer is not only farcical, but it's also a daunting prospect. And if we look around the world, the successful so-called civilized nations, which often referred to as the Anglo-Saxon nations by the French, do things differently, and they do things far better than France.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Anglo-Saxon nation. So I'm sitting here speaking to you from London. Often when I have briefly intervened in French political debates, I'm usually met with the criticism that the Anglo-Saxons have done everything wrong, and that's exactly where France doesn't want to go down. It strikes me that in the current sort of culture war phase of political life in the West, France has sort of two others. One is the long-standing other of the migrant, the Muslim, the North African second or third generation French citizen, which represents a threat to French society, French values, everything France as a post-Enlightenment nation thinks of itself. And then on the other hand, you have the Anglosphere. And this is also a bad alternative because they have, ultra-liberalized labor markets. They're obsessed with wokeism, transgender rights, multiculturalism. And these are also seen as to be equally evil and sort of antithetical to the French identity. Why do you think the Anglosphere still looms so large in the French psyche and is still part of this story of French declinism or the French identity crisis? And actually, with the whole wokeism debate, which seems to be cross-partisan, so you hear this on the far left, on the right, and the liberals all use these terms like wokeism as something that is threatening France, and it's coming from America and the UK. Is this also just another level of fragility that we see in the modern French Republic? Or is this actually something quite special about this relationship with the Anglosphere that modern France has always had, but now seems to be, I guess, much more poisonous in so many ways?
Well, I think France has always been enormously close to Britain, not just in terms of geography, but because the two countries have a long history of war, and everything has been done to avoid such wars since the Entente Cordiale of the early 20th century. And, American relationships with France remain very strong indeed. But I would contend that American and French relations are also historically fascinating, with the two nations learning masses from each other. Um, the in terms of concepts such as globalizations and wokeness, the so-called Anglo-Saxon nations do things very differently to the French, and this has often been a cause of great friction in terms of economics. The French are brilliant at global capitalism. The multinationals such as LVMH and L'Oreal are amongst the biggest and most successful in the world, along with the energy and waste disposal firms and the like. But they are not so successful domestically because the French still don't like rampant free market economics. They are far happier with long lunches and taking the whole of August off and early retirement and the like. And they certainly they like the idea of they don't like the idea of a Thatcherite revolution, and that's the kind of um, uh, the kind of uh, prospect epitomized by somebody like Nicolas Sarkozy, and of course Macron is often called the president of the rich. And as far as wokeness is concerned, the French are actually very socially conservative. They like society to remain pretty traditional, certainly in the vast swathes of countryside, um, and that make up so much of the country. And so progressive ideas are more prevalent in the cities. But even then, there is nothing like as much wokeness as in the Anglo-Saxon countries.
It also seems to be a way to stop France from having conversations about police brutality. So when Black Lives Matter became a global movement, often a response that you saw, and I saw this from French diplomats in the European Union who didn't want to open this conversation at European level because these are American problems. These are not French problems. We don't have police brutality. We don't have systematic discrimination against people of color. There's also equivalence, I think, with the Me Too movement, which again took hold in America and then spread across the world. And you saw figures, quite prominent figures from French movies and French culture, women of a certain generation who were also trying to push back and saying, well, we can't stop men from flirting with women. And actually, this is just about policing sexual behaviors. And this is not the kind of stuff that we do in France. So it feels like it's become quite a powerful argument to stop so much of the soul searching that perhaps France needs right now. Um, just before we end, I also want to touch on the foreign policy implications of everything that's in your book. You rightly point out that France is still the most visited country in the world. France still has a huge amount of cultural cachet in so many parts of the world because of its natural beauty and its rich history. But it strikes me as somebody who lives in London and who has friends from across the world, but many of my friends come from what's called the global south, countries in the Middle East and Africa. France actually has a terrible reputation among younger people who actually are far more aware about some of the more poisonous social and cultural elements that happen in France. And this is always a disconnect when I speak to my French friends who really don't seem to understand that people informally boycott France. People in my social circle say that they will never visit France as a form of protest against what they see as the country's, deep-seated racism towards its own citizens. This has foreign policy implications. France in 2003 was feted as the European country which stood up most to the US and the UK in opposing the Iraq War. And Dominique de Villepin, who was then Prime Minister, sort of went viral even back in the day with a speech at the United Nations. It seems that 2003 was probably a high watermark for France, in particular its relations with Middle Eastern countries. And we've seen to be on a decline ever since. Can you speak about what you think is the international reputation France holds beyond Europe and the West, and actually in countries further towards the East, also in Africa? And maybe by concluding, we could also think about how France has tried to navigate the crisis in Gaza. And it seems that they've been stuck between two responses. At home, domestically, Macron, the French government, were one of the first to say that they didn't want to have pro Palestinian marches on French streets. They went as far to say that they would be banned, even though people have then gone out subsequently and protested. But Macron has also, as he often wants to do, put himself as in a position of a global mediator, calling for a ceasefire before many of his colleagues in the European Union, and placing France again in that sort of role as being a constructive ally to countries in the Middle East. It
Mm.
seems to be more paradoxical than it's ever been, given the domestic position. So, how would you judge where Macron, France, right now thinks about itself as a global power?
Well, I think, speaking of very current events that are unfolding, I think the Israel Palestine conflict has always been huge in France. The country is home to probably the largest of Muslims, it is home to the largest Muslim community in Western Europe, and Muslims who can trace their background to North African countries that went through horrific colonial experiences as well. And so the support for Palestinians is naturally massive. But despite this, recent administrations, including Macron's and Francois Hollande's before him, have tried to clamp down on protests in support of Palestine, were showing an awful lot of support to pro-Israel groups. And as you quite rightly highlighted, this it stands in sharp contrast with France's more traditional pro-Arab position, not least of all in its opposition to the Iraq War, for example. And so the banning of pro-Palestine marches has been quite pathetic, frankly, especially given the number of non-Muslims who turn up at these rallies, including masses of Jews and those without faith. I've attended a number of those rallies, and I can assure you that faith plays a very little part in why people are demonstrating. And when those protests do go ahead, they're extremely peaceful and very well organized. And I'm afraid that the bans all play to the anti-Muslim bias in French society, as laïcité, which is the French version of secularism, is used or indeed weaponized to clamp down on all strong cultural and religious expressions. And so there is no doubt that the right, and indeed the far right, are currently using Israel and Palestine as another means of clamping down on Muslims generally. And as far as Macron's role is concerned, I mean, he likes to project himself as somebody who can get on with everybody. And so he's offered himself as a mediator in the current hostilities, but he's failing miserably as ever. We also remember how he failed to stop Putin's Russia invading Ukraine, for example, and his influence on warmongers like Netanyahu are even less effective.
Nabila, we haven't even touched on so many issues that I want to talk about. The word laïcité hasn't come up so much in this conversation. But I'm afraid for everyone who is interested in all the things that we didn't get to touch on, I would recommend that you pick up Nabila's fantastic book. I think it's one of the most important interventions in recent years about understanding a country which is so important for Brits, but also for the European Union, and anyone who really wants to think about how modern multicultural post-colonial societies are navigating very difficult economic, social and political terrains. Nabila, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you Intelligence Squared for hosting us on this podcast.
Thank you for having me.